So, folks, I guess I should ask, does anyone here tonight know the difference between the Jewish people, the Jews, and the people of Israel? Do you even know that there is a difference?
People of Israel are braver.
Ah?
They're braver in Israel.
They're braver than the Jewish people.
Oh, yeah. Not him.
Well, not all Jews are Israel,
Right.
and not all Israel are Jews. Of course, when you say Israel, you're including all of the tribes, the 12 tribes. And when you say the Jewish people, strictly speaking, you're referring to the descendants of Judah. The descendants of Judah became known as Yehudas. Ultimately, we ended up with the English word Jew. And it's really strictly speaking to the descendants of Judah. Now, why did the Jews or the descendants of Judah become synonymous with the sons of Israel? We studied this back when we looked at history, and even in the period of the Judges. There was a split in the kingdom, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. The southern kingdom comprised mostly of the tribe of Judah, Benjamin also, and some of the Levites. So Judah was by and large the predominant tribe in all of Israel, certainly in the south, from Beth El south. Remember, from Beth El north were the 10 tribes of the north. And they became known as Israel. They became synonymous with Israel, but actually Israel is the 12 tribes. Benjamin, Judah, all of the tribes. So when the northern kingdom was taken off into the diaspora, from that perspective, Israel was dispersed, but all of Israel was not dispersed, right? Because you still had Judah and you had Benjamin. And by the time 586 BC came along, which was when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and the dispersion of Judah began, there had already been a mix of all the tribes. Some of the tribes of the north had already begun to integrate with the tribes in the south. And so when the dispersion occurred in 722 BC in the north with the Assyrians, remember what we said back when we studied history. It was not a complete dispersion. Only initially 20,000, and then later on 90,000. So altogether you had about 110,000 people that were taken out from the northern kingdom, from the tribes of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Reuben. And Gad. And so initially, you're talking about a very small percentage of the 10 tribes in the north were actually taken out into the diaspora. So by and large, you had all the tribes in place, except that in Samaria, which is the region of Ephraim, you had these Samaritans. And so we talked about the Samaritans last week. Who were the Samaritans? Well, they were sort of a mix between the sons of Ephraim, the tribes of the north, and the peoples of the Assyrian Empire that they integrated together. But by and large, the tribes were in place. So Israel, effectively Israel was still intact, but you had Judah as a leading tribe in the south. So when Judah was taken out into the diaspora along with the 10 tribes of the north, particularly in the Grecian world, they became known as, but they became known as Yehudas, Judas. And that's where, particularly with the Persians, I should say, they became known as Judas. And that's where the word Jew came from. But even in the Persian kingdom, it wasn't referring only to the tribes or to the tribe of Judah, it was referring to all of Israel. Because by the time Judah was taken out into the diaspora, 586 BC and following, some of the tribes of the north followed them out into the diaspora. Willingly went out, because life in the land of Israel became very difficult, and it became more practical and prosperous to live in the diaspora. So many of the tribes of Israel went out and joined Judah in the diaspora. We studied 2 weeks ago the story of Esther. Mordecai, he was a Benjaminite, right? So he was of the tribe of Benjamin. Well, you can say that he was associated with Judah and that's why he was in the diaspora. But no, history tells us, Jewish history tells us, that the 10 tribes reintegrated in the diaspora with Judah but the predominant tribe was Judah. So when the ingathering began, and tonight we're going to look at this in a more chronological way, when the ingathering began in the last century and a half, it was an ingathering of all the people of Israel. But of course by then and now, they're known as Jews. But not only the descendants of Judah are being returned to the land of Israel. Again, perhaps the predominant tribe represented in Israel today is perhaps the tribe of Judah. But we have to believe and maintain that they are representatives of all the tribes in Israel today. And so we'll get back to this in a little while. So I wanted to make sure that you understand that not all Jewish people are Israel, and not all Israel are Jews, strictly speaking, from that point of view. All right? So as long as we understand that, I think we can move on. So when we talk about the history of the Jews, we're talking about the history of Kol Israel, all of Israel. All right, so we're going to begin tonight by recapping what we studied in Leviticus chapter 26. So why Leviticus chapter 26? Let's go back and we're going to recap this because I know we studied it once before. Well, a couple of times actually. We studied it once and we went back and recapped it a couple of times. So why Leviticus chapter 26? Anyone? No. 23. Leviticus 23 talks about all the feasts. Leviticus chapter 26 is an equally important chapter in the Bible. Right, because for the first time in the Torah, in the biblical account actually, we're seeing the reality of a possible dispersion of all of Israel. That all of Israel would be dispersed based on their obedience to God. So it's very carefully laid out in chapter 26 of Leviticus. Meticulously, I would say, laid out in chapter 26 of Leviticus. So we're going to recap this real quickly. Chapter 26. Let's read. Let's just read 1 to 3. You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. So no statues, no Baals. The figured stone can be a Baal, but the sacred pillar is the Baal. All right, and so you ladies are sensitive, but I'm going to tell you that the sacred pillar is a phallic symbol that represented Baal. All right, and so they placed them throughout the land. In many cultures, pagan cultures around the world, you see this. And it's a fertility symbol. It's a symbol of Baal. And so God is specifically warning them concerning the worship of Baal and paganism or idolatry altogether. Have nothing to do with it, he says, because I am the Lord your God. Don't engage in worship of the other gods. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, let's read on, then I shall give you rains in their seasons so that the land will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. So for much of the chapter at this point, well, at least for 4 or 5 verses, well, up to actually 13 verses, it's dealing with what will be if they were to obey God, not engage in idolatry, obey the Sabbaths, and follow after God carefully. He would bless them. And you need to read this again. We read this before on your own. So up to verse 13 is dealing with what God will do for Israel if they would in fact obey him. Now verse 14 all the way to 33 deals with what will happen if they would not obey him, if they would engage in idolatry. Now we know the subsequent history of Israel. The subsequent history is that they did exactly what he said they would do. He said, and now later on in the book of Deuteronomy, we'll look at that here in a few moments, Moses knew, this is 40 years after Moses gave them this message of Leviticus chapter 26. 40 years later, it was as if Moses knew that Israel would actually do this. And we'll see that here in a few moments. So let's just talk about 14 to 33 of Leviticus 26. This is very, very essential if we're going to understand Jewish history or the history of Israel. So we see that immediately God says that if they would not obey him, that he will bring pestilence upon the land. What's a pestilence? Give me an example of a pestilence. Viruses, yes, diseases, pestilences, and so on, yes. A locust can be a pestilence. They can be a plague as well. We'll talk about plagues also. So he will bring pestilences upon them if they would transgress his laws, profane his sanctuary, and break his Sabbaths. And then he goes on, he says, if you continue, if you don't heed my warning with the pestilences, and you continue, I will bring war upon you, an enemy occupation upon them. And then he goes on to say, if you do not, even after that, repent, I'll bring famine upon the land. Which by the time of Elijah the prophet, this is where they were. They had experienced pestilence because of their idolatry. They had experienced war. The Syrians and the Arameans were pestering them constantly. So they had experienced pestilence, enemy occupation, and by the time of the prophet Elijah, they had begun to experience famine, lack of rain, shortage of water, no produce in the land. God is faithful to his word, right? And then it says that if they would continue, even after all of this, God says that he will bring plagues upon them. And this actually God fulfilled. And so God here is being very careful to warn them a millennia before, 500 years before, what will happen if they would in fact engage in idolatry, and they went right ahead and did all of this. And so that now God goes on to say, now even after all of these, if you continue in this, I'm going to multiply this 7 times over. So God is determined that his people will treat him holy. He's determined that Israel will be a sanctified, a holy nation, just as he's called them to be. And then he goes on to say, if even then you do not. So think of the progression of the punishment. He's going to bring that 7 times upon them. He says there in verse 30 that he is going to abhor them. In verse 29, that they will eat the flesh of their sons and eat the flesh of their daughters as a result of all the punishment that they will receive. Horrible punishment. But then he goes on to say, if you persist, even after this, I will bring the worst absolute punishment upon you, which is diaspora. So from God's point of view, the absolute worst punishment that he can bring upon Israel is not that he would annihilate them as a nation and break his covenant, because God is a covenant-keeping God. The absolute worst thing he will bring upon them for their persistence in iniquity is he will drive them out into the nations. So I want you to perceive the mind of God here, how God is thinking, how he is viewing everything. In other words, the thing that God wants is for them to be in the land and to prosper in the land, to obey his commandments, to keep his Sabbaths, and they would prosper. Verse 1 or verse 3 to 13, God wants to fulfill that. But they did not, and they will not, and they did not. And so God went on to say now in Leviticus chapter 26, 34 to 40, that he will give the land its Sabbaths. When they are driven out, he would correct their mistakes, and he will make their wrongs right by giving the land the Sabbaths that they didn't give to the land. So I want you to see this. How important is the land to God? That the children of Israel would defile the land by not giving the land its Sabbaths. They would perform idolatry and all manner of sin on the land, and for the sake of the land, God is going to drive them out. Isn't that a different perspective that we have here of God? He wants the land to be holy. He wants the land to be restored. So it brings to bear the reality that there's something about that land that's very precious to God. They were to be sojourners in the land, to be keepers of the land. Right? In the parable of the vineyard, which we've talked about, both in Matthew chapter 21 and in Isaiah chapter 5, the parable speaks of the land being his vineyard, and the land and the people. His vineyard, a precious item to God. So for verse 34 to 39, he talks about giving the land its Sabbaths. Now we're going to read verse 40 to 45, and we're just going to pick it up from here. Now, Israel is dispersed in the nations because of their complete disregard for God's sanctuary and the Sabbaths and his law, and now he's putting the emphasis now on the latter days. The land has received the Sabbaths that they did not give to it. And so now in verse 40, if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their forefathers in their unfaithfulness which they committed against me, and also in their acting with hostility against me, I also was acting with hostility against them to bring them into the land of their enemies. Or if their uncircumcised heart becomes humble, so that they then make amends for their iniquity. So what is God pursuing here? He's pursuing their humility, their repentance. Their penitence is what he's looking for, that they would make amends for their sins. Now, by what means are their sins being made amends for? By the very same means by which our sins are made amends for. Because the Lamb of God, Jesus, his blood was shed from the world's foundation for Israel and for us. For all sin. So they would make amends by doing what? By being driven out into the nations, and after a certain time in the nations, they would humble themselves, and they would return to him, and their sins would be amended. Then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember also my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham as well, and I will remember the land. So think about this. The covenant is on an equal par with the land from God's point of view here. In regards to relevance, his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is at that place where the land is. He will remember his land. He will remember the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, the land and the people are essential in God's view. The redemption of the land and the people is God's, like we've talked about before, his nakalah, his inheritance. For the land will be abandoned by them and will make up for its Sabbaths, while it was made desolate without them. They meanwhile will be making amends for their iniquity, because they rejected my ordinances, and their soul abhorred my statutes. Yet in spite of this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, nor will I so abhor them as to destroy them, breaking my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. So God, again, is considering his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the land. He's making sure that the land receives its Sabbaths. And when the land receives its Sabbaths, then it will be ready for that aspect of his covenant, the people and for their return. But I will remember for them the covenant with their ancestors, whom they brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord. So this right here, in a micro vision, captures the history of Israel. But it's being laid out from the perspective of Sinai, from that point in time, Sinai. So 3,500 years ago, God presented to the children of Israel, all of them, this possibility that they should obey him, and if they would obey him, they would prosper in the land. But if they do not obey him, he goes at length to elaborate on what will occur. It's as if he knows very well, and he does, that they would in fact transgress against him. So he was very, very meticulous to lay out almost step by step exactly what will happen. But in the end of that process, they're back in the land. For the sake of his covenant, the land is ready for them, and they are brought back to the land. And that's really the extent of Jewish history, or the history of Israel. Now, let's go to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, 40 years later, Moses spent, from that point, 40 years in the wilderness with the children of Israel. How many times did they transgress against God and rebel against Moses and God? More than once. I think it's actually 11 times. If my calculation is correct, from the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus, I think 11 times they transgressed against God. Horribly. They've grumbled against Moses, they grumbled against God, they rejected the manna, and Miriam and the elders of Israel, and it's just on and on and on, they rebelled against God. And I think Moses at this point, he's about up to here with the children of Israel. And so when he preaches the book of Deuteronomy at this point, it's as if he fully well understands that Israel, you're destined to transgress against God. You will. And when you do, what I preached at Sinai is exactly what's going to happen. So let's go to Deuteronomy 4. We're going to pick it up in verse 25. When you become the father of children and children's children and have remained long in the land and act corruptly and make an idol in the form of anything, so and do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger. Now note here that he didn't say if you do, he said when you do. So it's as if Moses fully well understands that you will do the very thing that I warned you about at Sinai. Provoke your Lord God to anger. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long in it, but will be utterly destroyed. So Moses is speaking in a definite manner. You will be destroyed. You will go over, you will possess this land across the Jordan. You will have children and they will have children, but you will transgress against God and you will be dispossessed from the land. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. There you will serve gods, many gods, the works of man's hands, wood and stone, which neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all of your heart and all of your soul. So, verse 27 and 28, we know, well, we know some of the aspects of the history of Israel, but we know clearly that Israel went through a terrible time in the nations, particularly 500 years of the Inquisition, which we'll talk about in a few moments, where they were forced to kneel before statues, idols, made of stone and wood, and they couldn't speak nor hear, but they were forced to worship these idols. So we will get right back to that in a few moments. So all of these elements of what Moses is prophesying against Israel, we know by just reading this and a basic understanding of the history of Israel has been fulfilled. Okay? But verse 29 correlates with what we just looked at in Leviticus chapter 26, 40 to 45. Right? When you call upon his name, when you repent, right? That's what we just read in verse 29. Let's read it again. But from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all of your heart and all of your soul. When you are in distress and all these things have come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. For the Lord your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. So God, again, he is going to be faithful to his covenant. Now, in this context, he didn't mention the land. But, of course, in Leviticus chapter 26, the land was a vital aspect of everything that God was going to do with Israel. Also in regards to the restoration of Israel, right? So the land is obviously a part of it. But, verse 30, it says there, when you are in distress, when all of these warnings, all of these punishments have come upon you, Then you will call upon his name. But it says something that's very important. You will listen to the Lord your God. You will listen to his voice. So this is speaking of a whole different disposition in regards to Israel. A time when Israel would hear the voice of God and they would listen to his voice. So, how well is the nation of Israel in regards to carrying this out today? How well are they carrying that out today? Not very well. Not very well. The percentage of the Jewish nation, Israel, that are absolutely walking in faith and trusting God is relatively small. Today you have, which for the first time since 70 AD, you have more Jews or more sons of Israel in the land of Israel than outside of the land of Israel. This is very, very exciting, and this is very new. But yet you have a little under half of the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, still in the diaspora. And the ones in the diaspora are pretty secular. They're more or less in the diaspora, wanting to stay in the diaspora. You have certain concentrations of the sons of Israel, the Jewish nation, that are very religious, such as in New York, some in Los Angeles, some in Miami, and even in Chicago, other places in the world where you have little concentrations of Jewish people, the sons of Israel, that are religious. Does not mean that they're particularly faithful in terms of biblical faith. It means that they're religious and they're holding on to the traditions, which is better than being secular. All right? Although sometimes I wonder, but it's better than being secular. Now, based on what we've read in Ezekiel, we see that God would ultimately sanctify all of Israel. He will pour clean water out on them, and he will bring them back to the land. All of them he will restore to the land. By what means will he get a little under 50% of the Jewish nation back into the land of Israel? I have no idea. I don't know what he's going to do. You have many speculations. You know, we Christians, we like to speculate about that. What do we say? How is God going to get them back to the land? What are some of the things that we say? Persecution, and the persecution will bring them back to the land. Now, from the point of view of the pre-tribulationist, Christian, many of them are looking forward to seeing the persecution of the Jewish people, the sons of Israel. Why? Because it signals that we're about to be raptured out of here, right? Sounds absurd, right? But it's absolutely true. I know this for a fact. Because I've interacted with many of these pre-tribulation rapturist Christians that are just looking for the rapture. Again, from their point of view, Israel is simply a timeline, and they don't really care about the nation of Israel in terms of persecution. Let the persecution begin. We just need to get out of here. Now, if that sounds absurd, I'm not apologizing for it. It's absolutely true. There are Christians that think that way. No. God can very well use persecution or the threat of persecution to get Jews, the Jewish nation that's still scattered among the nations, back into the land of Israel. Certainly he can. I am of the persuasion that the time of Jacob's trouble has ended, and that the Jewish nation will not experience the troubles that they've experienced in the past any longer. Does that mean the Jews would not be killed or persecuted? Of course. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is going to be a lot of that, but it's not going to be on the same level that we've seen in the past, because again, I am convinced that after 1948, the state of Israel coming into existence, there was a powerful change in God's timeline. The time of God's favor to Israel began right at that time. And there was a shift. In the spirit world, in the heavenlies, there was a shift, and God's favor and his love and his commitment to Israel returned to Israel. And I don't believe that there's going to be 7 years of tribulation poured out on Israel. Israel went through roughly 7 years of persecution, the Nazi terror, which was roughly 7 years. We don't need any more of that. And so I'm not of that persuasion at all. I am convinced that God will bring them back. He will take them back to the land of Israel. Perhaps there would be a threat of persecution. Perhaps they will return because life among the nations or life in the nations would become very difficult and intolerable, and the land of Israel suddenly would become a Mecca for them. Yes?
And there's Israelis that I've met, we all know Natalie, she's got a story. Jewish people that lived here in the United States that just, I don't know why, I just feel like I need to be in the land. It's God speaking to their heart.
Absolutely. So that phenomenon is as old as the modern Zionist movement. And what I mean is, since about the mid-1800s, even before then even, Jews around the world, the sons of Israel from around the world, many of them had felt this pull, this tug. It's a very ancient pull. Every year for Pesach, since the diaspora of 70 AD, and even before, ever since then, every Pesach, you know how they end their Seders?
Next year in Jerusalem.
Yes, next year in Jerusalem, right? And so they've been saying this every year for 2,000 years, since 70 AD. And so that lights a Zionist fire in a soul if you pray it enough, if you believe it enough. So just in that hope, yes, there's been the hope of the ingathering or the regathering in the collective hearts of the Jewish nation, ever since 70 AD. But since the modern Zionist movement, there's been a phenomenon in the world where individual sons of Israel from Russia, from South America, from the United States of America, from many parts of the world, will suddenly have a sense of a call, a deep spiritual connection that will connect with them and pull them back to the land of Israel, pull them to make Aliyah. And that's very real. And now, but there will come a time, I believe, when God will do certain things that will make the land of Israel appealing on a very large scale for the people of Israel that are dispersed. I don't think it's going to be massive persecution. Hundreds and thousands of Jews are going to be slaughtered. I don't believe that. Now, I could be wrong. Yes, I do know for a fact that there will be some persecution that will motivate them and lead them back to the land of Israel. Yes, of course. Yes.
And with the one world order,
Mm-hmm.
and how even what we see now, that they are so against Israel, once that happens, would there be much more, they would think or perceive the threat being more intense and therefore?
Absolutely. So what's been happening in Europe, for instance, in the last 4 or 5 years since the Arab Spring and the influx of Syrian and Iraqi refugees into Europe, that's been a catalyst to motivate Aliyah in places like France and Germany and other parts of Europe. So yes, those things, and again, I think we've talked about it on the program. I think without any question, those refugees coming into Europe was part of the global agenda, part of the New World Order agenda. It was slated to happen here as well, but the Trump phenomenon put a stop to it. We hope that it's a permanent stop, but I don't think it is. Ultimately, so the New World Order people, the globalists, are not going to change course. They're going to stay on course. And ultimately, they will have a part to do, they will have something to do with the pressure that will come upon the Jewish nation that will ultimately lead them to Aliyah. And at some point, the restoration of Israel would be complete. And what we've talked about so far would be fulfilled. And all of Israel would listen to God's voice. They would listen to his voice. Now, the Word of God, we know from a Christian point of view, of course, is Jesus. He is the Word of God. The Torah is the written Word. He is the living Word. And we know that. We're conditioned to understand that. Now, it says there that in the latter days we're pointing towards the end time. In other words, they will listen to his voice. They will hear his voice. So it's referring to hearing the voice of Jesus. They would hear his voice. Now, John says in his letter that as he is, so are we in this world. And that's another way of saying that we represent him in this world. When I say we, I'm saying Christians. But do all Christians really represent him in this regard? No. And the answer is no. There is a movement in the church, in Messiah, in other words, there is a movement of people that are understanding more and more the importance of our ministry towards Israel. That we would speak the words of Messiah to them, that we would speak his word to them, and that they would receive it. Well, it's happening. It is happening. It's happening on a very minute scale at this point, perhaps not as minute, but it's happening. Well, my conviction is that this will continue to happen. More and more believers, collectives of believers, churches, will understand this, perceive it, and act upon it, and begin to function in it, where Israel will begin to hear the voice of their Messiah in us. And I think that has been preordained by God. And that's what Moses is referring to in the latter days, when the process of the ingathering begins. And we know that when the process of the ingathering begins, there's synonymously, at the same time, simultaneously, I should say, the nations will turn against Israel. So you have the nations turning against Israel, you have God bringing the people of Israel back to the land of Israel, but then you have the voice of Messiah, the voice of God, as another factor in the whole thing, that's speaking to Israel, that's speaking comfort to them, Isaiah chapter 40, that's telling them that their warfare is ended, and that God has given you twice the punishment for your iniquity, and he's no longer holding it against you. This is the voice of God that will speak to them. They will hear that voice, and they will listen to that voice. That's what the prophecy says. All right. Now, having said all of that, let's begin now at Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15 is where we really see the genesis of the Jewish nation, or the people of Israel. Why would I say that? Because it's in Genesis chapter 15 that God effectively established the covenant with Abraham. And as we learned in this course, that covenant with Abraham was extended to Isaac and to Jacob, right? We talked about this back when we looked at in Torah too. And then it was further extended to all of Israel at Mount Sinai. So at Mount Sinai is where God established the covenant with the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the sons of Israel. In Genesis chapter 15 is where God establishes the covenant with Abraham, and he says to Abraham, verse 13, he says, God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. Now he said, you in turn, you will die, and you'll go to be with your ancestors, with your fathers. And then it goes on to talk about the sin of the Amorites, verse 16. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here back to the land of Israel, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The Amorites, well, they were the leading tribe of the Canaanites in the land. When the word Amorite is used here, it's referring to all of the Canaanites. So God has given the Amorites, the Canaanites, 400 years to repent. After that 400-year period, he's going to bring the sons of Israel into the land, and the purpose of the sons of Israel coming into the land is to redeem the land. And in the process of redeeming the land on behalf of God, they would remove the Canaanites. All right? The Canaanites would have an option, go across the border. You can also become a sojourner and ultimately a convert, perhaps. But you have no options. God has given you 400 years to repent. 4 generations. The time has come to move on. And that's the purpose of Israel coming into the land. Israel did not carry this out. The subsequent history tells us from the Bible, from the biblical account, that Israel did not carry this mission out. And that became the reason for Israel's constant stumbling. Remember when we studied in Judges, right? Because they did not cleanse the land of the Canaanites, the Amorites, they continued in a cycle of what? Sin, bondage. They would cry out. God would send a judge. They would repent, and everything would be fine. And then lo and behold, it happens all over again. And that continued throughout the period of the judges, even into the period of the kings, and ultimately God drove them out into the nations. So, starting at Sinai, when the covenant was established with Israel, what happened before Sinai? Well, God brought them out of Egypt. Right? He destroyed the Egyptian empire. He humbled all of the Egyptian gods, and he purchased Israel from Pharaoh. How did he purchase Israel from Pharaoh? By the blood of the lamb. Right? The Passover lamb. The blood was applied over the entire nation of Israel, and they were removed from bondage in the midst, as slaves in the midst of Egypt. Who sent them to Egypt to begin with? God did. I often think of God sending Israel into Egypt as sort of an incubator, a national incubator for his people, where they would grow to be a strong people. In slavery, in bondage, they will grow to be a strong people, which they did. They outnumbered the Egyptians. They were more fruitful than the Egyptians were, and the Egyptians were horrified of them, because they were resilient, strong people, and God sort of, again, he brought the 70 descendants of Jacob, Israel, into the land of Israel, and from 70 they became 2 million in 400 years, and they were prospering. And at that time in history, that's impressive. In 400 years, 4 generations, to go from 70 to over 2 million, it's impressive. And so God actually saw Israel as his army, right? We've talked about that before. He said it, Israel is his host, his army, Zavaot, his host. And so he prepares his army, Israel, to come into the land of the Canaanites before they had this mission before they would execute their mission in cleansing the land of the Canaanites. He would establish his covenant with them at Sinai. Now, let's talk about Sinai before we go into the history of the Jewish nation. What was Sinai? Sinai was, let me just say this, Sinai was a betrothal. God determined to betroth Israel unto himself at Sinai. In other words, it was an engagement. He wanted to engage Israel to be his wife, his bride. Now, I think we've studied that already in this course, where Isaiah, Hosea, even in Jeremiah, Israel is referred to as God's wife, his bride. So at Sinai, he established this covenant. So if you've ever been to a Jewish wedding, you know that there's a ketubah, right? You know what a ketubah is, which is a covenant. So the covenant that he established with Israel at Sinai was effectively a ketubah. Who officiated the wedding? Well, Moses and Aaron. They were the officials. All right, they were to officiate this wedding between God and Israel, and things didn't go as planned. All right, Israel almost immediately turned towards harlotry. From God's perspective, right there at Sinai, at the foot of Sinai, they began to commit adultery. Even before they were married, played a harlot with another god, the golden calf. Right there at the foot of Sinai, God's preparing an engagement. He's built a chuppah, Sinai, the clouds and so on. He's built a chuppah. He's going to engage them, take them to be his wife, and they're already playing the harlot at the foot of Sinai. And so the ketubah was given, and the wedding wasn't consummated, of course. God postponed the whole event, but also clearly we see in Jeremiah 31, in Hosea, that there would come a time when God would reinitiate this ketubah and the wedding will occur. Now with that, let's get into the actual history of the Jewish nation. So Sinai was a betrothal event, an engagement between God and his people Israel. He gave the ketubah, but he sort of knew at Sinai that his bride-to-be would be unfaithful. She would be a harlot. He knew it. He knew it, right? And he knew what he would have to do to bring things to the point where he can bring to himself his bride as if she was a virgin. Once again, he would have to drive her out into the nations where she would just sort of slam her face into the ground, get to the place where she would absolutely refuse all of the other suitors, all of the other gods, and she would return to him. This is what Hosea talked about, Hosea chapter 2. Very, very carefully God said that. And so Sinai, so at Sinai, they left Sinai and they went northwards to enter into the land of Israel, Kadesh Barnea, the children of Israel. At Kadesh Barnea, the 12 spies went out. It wasn't God's idea, first of all, to send spies into the land. As far as God was concerned, just go take the land. But the children of Israel said, let's send some spies in. Let's go in there. Let's size things up. Again, God never ordained that spies should go in. All of Israel should have gone in. So they sent the spies in. That was a mistake. All right. So in the land now, the spies come back and they bring an evil report. 10 did. Joshua and Caleb, they were faithful. The other 10 were not. So, by the way, Joshua and Caleb, they represented the leading tribes, which were Ephraim and Judah in the south. Caleb was Judah, Joshua was Ephraim. And so these two, the two representatives of the leading tribes said, no. We got to take this land. God brought us here. Remember what he did at Sinai, and remember what he did at the Red Sea. God is for us. These giants are nothing. But the sons of Israel said, no, we're not going. And of course, God showed his determination that they would go. And then they said, okay, we'll go. But then it was too late. It was too late at that point. God had determined at Kadesh Barnea that generation would die out. It was as if God said, no, that generation, evil seed. They will die out in the wilderness. I'll work with the subsequent generation, which he did. So that generation now in the wilderness, they grew to be strong, they grew to be faithful, the younger generation. Moses and Aaron, Joshua and Caleb were perhaps some of the very few of the older generation that lived through the whole process. We don't know exactly how many did, but I would think that there were more than 4 of them that were faithful. Certainly there were. At any rate, these Joshua, Caleb, Moses, Aaron, and the others led the children of Israel through that 40-year wilderness experience. And from God's point of view, it was a filtering process, right? It didn't take them 40 years to get from Kadesh Barnea to the Jordan because of distance or the terrain. It took 40 years because God was filtering out the elements of no faith, the elements of unbelief. And so when that element was completely gone, 40 years later, he brings them around now to the Yarden, to the Jordan, at Mount Nebo. And there Moses repeats the covenant, more or less, with the book of Deuteronomy. This is just before Moses dies, or he goes up on the mountain and gives his life, lays his life down for God. So at Mount Nebo, where Israel now is ready to cross over the Yarden, the Jordan, just as they cross over the Red Sea, they're going to cross over the Jordan. Now the Jordan is much smaller than the Red Sea. But the miracle of the Jordan is just as impressive as the miracle of the Dead Sea, right? Because God had to hold back an entire sea, but it's just as much an amazement that he held back the Jordan River as well. So they were going to cross over, just as they crossed over from the Red Sea, from Egypt, into the Sinai desert. They were going to cross over from the east side of the Jordan into the west side of the Jordan, the land of Israel. What is the purpose? What are they coming in to do? They're coming in as the Lord's host. Who's the captain of the Lord's host? Who met Joshua right there? Well, Jesus, we would say. So God's host is ready. His army is ready. His captain is ready. They come into the land. Moses dies. He goes up. He preaches Deuteronomy, 33 chapters. He goes up on Mount Nebo and he dies. Israel crosses over and they begin to engage the enemy. The very first enemy, of course, was Jericho. Jericho was a formidable city, a formidable enemy, and Israel was faithful to God. They obeyed God, the captain of the Lord's host, and they defeated Jericho. We know the story well. From that point on, they merged into what we know as the conquest of the land. Now, the conquest of the land took about 6 years, 6.5 years or so. But the conquest of the land was not complete. In other words, after Joshua basically hung up his hat, there were still Canaanites in the land. God, during the process of the conquest of the land, God helped them supernaturally. Remember the story of the Gibeonites. Okay, what was the story of the Gibeonites? Israel was not supposed to strike a deal or a covenant with any of the inhabitants of the land, but they did. And this was sin. And this brought hardship upon Israel. And because of that covenant, the Amorites formed a confederation in the south. The Jebusites and the Amorites and many of the ites came against not the Girgashites. Anyway, they formed a confederation and they went after the people that made this covenant with Israel, with Joshua and the people of Israel, the Gibeonites. And so they wanted to destroy the Gibeonites, this confederation, because they made a covenant with Israel. And so God saw an opportunity to destroy the confederation. The confederation did not come into existence to get after Israel. They were afraid of Israel. They were coming after the Gibeonites, because the Gibeonites kind of went against their will. And in the process, Israel defended the Gibeonites because they made a covenant with the Gibeonites. And of course, God, you know the story, God destroyed the confederation. Joshua prayed that the sun will stay in one place for an entire day so that he would be able to carry out the victory against the Amorites, and God held the sun in one place. So you know the story. So the conquest began, but the conquest was not complete. Israel never completed the process of purifying the land, driving out the Canaanites. And for that reason, we have the period of the judges, right? God would have never had it that judges would have ruled in the land of Israel. God's system was as such that the Levites would be the rightful judges in the land of Israel, and that they would rule over the people of Israel, and that they would be the servants of Israel, the priests, the Kohanim, mostly. The Kohanim was ordained by God to be the tribe, the priestly tribe, that will point the way to Israel in terms of righteousness. Well, the Kohanim, they were unable to do that because all of Israel became corrupt because of idolatry. Why? Because they allowed the Canaanites to exist alongside them when they should have rid the land of the Canaanites. And they did not. So time goes on. Of course, you know the story with Eli. Eli was a Kohanim. His sons were corrupt. They were sons of Belial, as it refers to in the King James. And of course, the story of Samuel comes into play. Samuel was a judge. He was also a Kohanim. All right, he was a Kohanim. And he was a good judge. He was a righteous judge. He was also a prophet, feared throughout Israel. And Samuel judged and ruled Israel for a period of time, and that brings us to the point of King David. How did King David come into being? Well, he was ordained, we would say, from the world's foundation, for sure. But the people of Israel said, we want a king just like the Philistines and just like the Canaanites that were left in the land. We want a king. God never ordained such a thing for Israel. His system was, the Kohanim are your leaders. They are the ones to lead you. I am your king. I exist in the tabernacle. I'm there. If you need your king, come to him in the sanctuary, in the tabernacle. That was God's system. But suddenly they're looking away from God and they're asking for a king. They wanted to be like the other nations. Assimilation has always been a problem with the Jewish nation, with the people of Israel. Assimilation has always been a problem, still is a problem. And so they wanted to be like the nations. Give us a king. And God gave them a king. Samuel took it personally, but it wasn't for him to take it personally. And God gave them a king, and that king was, of course, Saul. A king in every visual aspect, a fitting king, tall in stature, a warrior, and so on. But what was the story with Saul? His heart was not circumcised. His heart was not given over to God. So some time goes by, and God is using Saul as a display for Israel, to display for them what you don't want. Then God comes along and says, I'm going to give you a king now, a ruler after my own heart, one who is pursuant of my heart. And who was King David? King David, now we know he is a forerunner of Messiah. He's a forerunner of Messiah in our belief, of course, Messiah Jesus. King David struggles for the kingship. Of course, he has to struggle for it. Saul is there, but God is teaching David to be a warrior. And so David becomes king in Hebron. 7 years he rules in Hebron. Saul dies, and then he becomes king in Jerusalem. He goes up to the Jebusite stronghold. To this point, Jerusalem had been a stronghold of the Jebusites. So as far back as 1000 BC, or as early, I should say, as 1000 BC, Jerusalem was still a Jebusite stronghold. The name of the city was Jebus, the place of the Jebusites. The Jebus means, if I'm not mistaken, the place where God is. Jebus, the place where God is. Jerusalem, now the Salem, became the place of God's peace, which is what Jerusalem means. And people have different opinions about that. And so the Jebusites were there. David now had the task of taking the stronghold of Zion away from the Jebusites, the city of Zion, which ultimately, of course, was Jerusalem. And David did this. He took the kingdom. He took the kingdom away from the Jebusites, the city, and he began to rule as the king of Israel in Jerusalem. About 10 BC, 1000 BC is when he began to reign. Of course, King David was a righteous king. He did have some shortcomings as a king. He was a man of war. His hands were stained with blood, and God promised that his son after him will be the one that will build the kingdom, a kingdom, a house, and a throne. His son after him. So we say, okay, well, that's, of course, it's referring to Solomon, but it's not. It's referring to the son of David, the Ben David, the Moshiach. And so some time goes by now, 500 years goes by, and of course, the other kings are nothing like King David. None of the other kings of Judah came close to be as their father David. And ultimately, they were all corrupt. Not all of them corrupt, but ultimately, the line of the kings became corrupt. In the north, we know that in the north, with Jeroboam, and every king that followed after Jeroboam was successfully corrupt and evil. Every king that succeeded Jeroboam was corrupt and evil, and the northern kingdom, in fact, was an apostasy. Never should have existed. The northern kingdom with Ahab gave us Jezebel. Jezebel gave us Athaliah, her daughter, who became a queen in Jerusalem. And because of Athaliah, Jerusalem becomes even more corrupt. Temple service becomes even more tainted with paganism, and Jerusalem becomes even more of a festering pot of abominations with Athaliah. Solomon had done enough to bring abominations to Jerusalem. He brought all of these pagan wives from all the different nations around India, certain parts of Africa, and they brought their paganism with them, and Jerusalem was a spiritual hotspot. Even after Solomon. And some of the kings were upright. Josiah, Jehoshaphat, some of the kings, Asa, they were good kings, and they did good things in Jerusalem, but they never brought Jerusalem to the place of purity. It was as if Jerusalem was so corrupt and infested, it had to be completely destroyed. Which takes us back to the parable of the vineyard that we saw in Isaiah chapter 5. So God ultimately destroys Jerusalem. He 722 BC, he destroyed the northern kingdom, Samaria, with the Assyrians. The Assyrians came down, by the way, or came up to take Jerusalem as if it was for them to do, with Sennacherib, but it wasn't for Sennacherib to take Jerusalem. And God destroyed the Assyrian army, but the Babylonians were not far off. The Babylonians now were appointed to be God's instrument of judgment on Jerusalem, which they carried out. Nebuchadnezzar and so on, he carried out his mission. God gave Nebuchadnezzar a mission which was to destroy Jerusalem and take captives into Babylon. And so this happened, and then, so 586 BC, a major mark in Jewish history, of course, the destruction of the first temple. Every Tisha B'Av, even today, the Jewish people, sons of Israel, they mourn the destruction of the first temple, Tisha B'Av, and all of the other atrocities that occurred following that at the time of Tisha B'Av, and so they all attributed to Tisha B'Av. In fact, some Jews believe, some religious Jews believe that Kadesh Barnea, the 10 spies, was at Tisha B'Av. In fact, in other words, the first Tisha B'Av catastrophic event in the life of Israel was Kadesh Barnea with the 10 spies. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what some believe. Nevertheless, the first temple was destroyed. The sons of Judah were suppressed. Some of the leading cities in Judah was overtaken by the Babylonians and subdued. The leading tribes or the leading classes of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin were taken out into Babylon. The Babylonians were taken over by the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire began to give favor to Israel. And of course, with King Cyrus, he ordained that the temple should be rebuilt, and that began the process of partial ingathering. We're talking about the ingathering of Ezra and Nehemiah. Zerubbabel became the governor, and he began to build, and he was a builder, and so on. And so Jerusalem was reestablished as a city. The prophets that we talked about, or that we're talking about in this section, who are Malachi, Haggai, and Zechariah, they were appointed to minister to the ingathering of that time. Now we know, especially looking back in history, from a historical context, that ingathering was a temporary and a partial ingathering. But we saw that in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11, that God will bring them back a second time. And when he brings them back a second time, it would be a complete ingathering, a full restoration, in other words. And but Israel came back. All right? So Jewish life was once again reinstated in Jerusalem, Judea, and even in Samaria, in the Galilee even, in the Negev. Once again, Jewish life, or the life of the sons of Israel, began to prosper in the land of Israel. And that brought us up to 70 AD. Of course, the major event leading up to 70 AD, of course, was the coming of Messiah Jesus, his crucifixion on the cross, his resurrection, and his ascension. In that process, he lived for 34 years. His ministry was only about 3.5 years, we believe. In that 3.5 year period, his prophecy concerning Jerusalem was what? That Jerusalem would be destroyed. And there would be yet another diaspora. Now, he proclaimed this. Luke chapter 21, he talked about the diaspora that would come. He said that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles would be fulfilled. So Jerusalem is from 70 AD onwards. Some would say that it was trampled underfoot of the Gentiles before 70 AD, which is possibly the case, right? Because the Romans and Herod the Idumean, they were Gentiles, and they had Jerusalem under their control. But Jesus said that Jerusalem will be underfoot of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles would be fulfilled. Now, we can see now in our history, contemporary history, or history of 50 years ago, or 55 years ago, that what? Jerusalem is no longer underfoot of Gentile. And that Jerusalem is now the sovereign possession of the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel once again. But Jesus prophesied that this would happen to Israel. It would be destroyed until a certain time, and that there would be another dispersion, which is exactly what we see roughly 35 years after Jesus ascends. So the prophet Jesus, who came as the suffering servant, right? In the Jewish world today, I guess it's been like this ever since the sages. There's been the idea, and I'm not sure which one of the Jewish sages spoke about the coming of two messiahs. Maybe it was Maimonides, I'm not sure. Maybe it was, I'm not sure. Some of the sages talked about the appearance of two messiahs, Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant, and Messiah ben David, the great king. And that Messiah would come in two appearances. All right. So from that point of view, they're correct. From our point of view, I should say, they're correct. Jesus came as the Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant. Certainly he was the suffering servant, but he was also a prophet. And of course we know that the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, they certainly considered him to be a prophet. Even today, they consider him to be a prophet. That's not something they would tell you. That's not something they will tell you, but their sages, the sages of 400, 500, 600, 1,000 years ago, certainly saw Yeshua as a prophet. Because he prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, and his prophecies were fulfilled. So given the standard of what determines a prophet, he foot the bill. And so he is a prophet. From a Jewish point of view, he was, in fact, from their point of view, a prophet. He still is a prophet, right? So he came, he fulfilled his role as a suffering servant, he offered his life, he fulfilled Isaiah chapter 53, then Jerusalem is destroyed, the people of Israel are taken out into the diaspora. Now they were already in the diaspora, okay? And for that, we'll go to the map. So 70 AD, Jerusalem comes under tremendous yoke of the Romans. The Romans ultimately in 70 AD succeeds to destroy Jerusalem and begins to scatter the people of Judah from the land of Israel. It's an almost complete scattering. In other words, after 70 AD into the Bar Kokhba revolt, Bar Kokhba was a Messiah figure. He saw himself as a Messiah. He was going to redeem Israel, Bar Kokhba. And we had the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is 160 years after Jesus, 160 AD or something. So you have a period of about 200 years when the land of Israel is effectively flushed of all of her sons, the people of Israel. Not completely. There was always a sprinkling. There was always a remnant in the land, very small and insignificant. Especially around places like Hebron, Jerusalem, places of significance. As they were driven out, they came right back. But in small numbers, insignificant. They were never able to establish any dimension of significant Jewish life after 70 AD. Especially during the Roman cleansing of the land. So it took the Romans about maybe 200 years to absolutely be satisfied that they've rid the land of all of their Jews, all of the Jews. So, if I can get this map under control, you have Jerusalem right here. The Romans, of course, they came by sea and some came by land. Acco was a major port for the Romans, and they would disembark here in Acco and come down, Jezreel, and march down into the land, and that's what they did. Ultimately, they overcame Jerusalem. The people of Israel would succumb. The elders of Israel at that time, most of them fled to Babylon, right? Babylon, if you look at the map of the world, they ultimately, Israel would leave the land of Israel and they would go to Babylon, which is this area right here on the map. At that time, it wasn't Babylon, really, it was ancient Persia. Susa was the capital of Persia. Susa became a really strong Mecca of Jewish life in the 2nd century AD. Susa was perhaps the major attraction for the Jews at that time, and they flooded into Susa. Not only did they go to Babylon or Susa, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, they also went to North Africa, Egypt, across to what is today's Libya, Tunisia, and they settled for a short time in the North African area. Life was difficult there, and ultimately, about in the 4th century, 3rd to 4th century, they began to cross over into Spain. What is Spain today? Let's call it the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. Even a part of France was considered a part of this region. What was What was the Iberian Peninsula and certain aspects of France called in the ancient world? Tarshish. Tarshish. The ships of Tarshish. You've heard about the ships of Tarshish. This is where, of course, the story of Jonah. Jonah he disembarked, I think, from what is today's Haifa, or maybe even Akko, and he went across the Mediterranean. He was headed to Tarshish. This is where he was going. Along the way, the story played out. Now, what about the Iberian Peninsula, or Tarshish, as it was called in biblical times? What about this area was attractive to the people of Israel? In other words, why did they, in the time span of about 2.5 centuries, ultimately find themselves here? Many of them, not all of them. Many of the sons of Israel simply went over to Susa, and they concentrated in what was Babylon or Susa. Some of them went further south. Some of the 10 tribes went further east, even into what's referred to as the Peshmergan Trail. Peshmerga is a trail that goes across the top here, from Syria, Turkey, all the way over to the Himalayas. Some of the 10 tribes settled in that area, but by and large, they concentrated in Susa, which was formerly Babylon. But why did they pursue to end up over here in the Iberian Peninsula in Tarshish? Anybody has an idea? No. No. The reason that they journeyed over here to Tarshish is the same reason that Jonah wanted to get to Tarshish, because Solomon had established communities in the Iberian Peninsula. Now, it doesn't say that in the Bible, but what it says in the Bible, in the book of Kings, is that Solomon, 10 BC, had the ships of Tarshish. And what did the ships of Tarshish do? The account that we find in the book of Kings is that they went to India. Ophir is the biblical word for India. That the ships of Tarshish traveled to India every 3.5 years and brought goods back to Solomon. But wait a minute. They were the ships of or in Tarshish. What was the connection between Tarshish and maritime living, shipping? What was the connection between the ships of Tarshish and Tarshish? This area right here, before Solomon sent sons of Israel to inhabit this area was basically a nomad type land where you had Celtics, ancient Celtics were there. From the northern part of Iberia, the Celtics were strong. The Gauls or the Celtics were strong in France, and they were also strong. They were nomadic, strong in the Iberian Peninsula as well. But Solomon had the entire world under his reign at one point. And the Phoenicians is where he learned the ships, where he got the ships of Tarshish from. Who were the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians were the Adriatic people. So the ships of Tarshish are actually Phoenician ships that Solomon began to use for shipping. In other words, Solomon, because of his statesmanship, had made a deal with the Phoenician people, had acquired ships and maritime technology from the Phoenicians, and began to sail ships all the way to Tarshish and to India, Ophir. How did he do that? From Tarshish, where according to every Jewish historical source, was during the time of Solomon, peppered with Jewish communities. 1000 BC. Peppered with Israeli communities, I should say, not Jewish communities. All right, so what's going on here? The ships of Tarshish, Tarshish is all the way over here, Israel is here, India is here. What's that about? Every 3.5 years, the ships of Tarshish will bring gold and other goods from India back to Israel. I'm going to propose this to you. The ships of Tarshish were all located here in what was effectively an Israeli outpost, and the ships of Tarshish went around to India, went around the Cape of Good Hope, went to India 3.5 years, and come back. That journey would take roughly 3.5 years. Now, why would he not just send his ships down the Red Sea, around this bend, and to India? That would be easier. Why would he not do that? Because it was extremely hostile. He would have to deal with the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, and all of the other tribes in this area, a very small sea, a very small channel here, whereas he already had control of the Mediterranean Sea with the ships of Tarshish. He had a community here, well, not a community, many communities of sons of Israel in Iberia. Now, if you do a conventional historical study on Europe, that part of Europe, they would tell you that somewhere around 800 BC, 1000 BC, the Phoenicians came to Spain. That's what conventional history would tell you. But they were Phoenician ships. They were not Phoenician people. In other words, they were not Grecian people. They were the sons of Israel with Phoenician ships, the ships of Tarshish. So that's conventional history of Spain and Portugal. Any historic source would tell you that. But they will not tell you that they were sons of Israel, which corresponds with Jewish history and with the Bible, the biblical account of Solomon having the ships of Tarshish, which went to India every 3.5 years and brought goods back to Solomon. So, if what I'm saying is true, and I'm convinced that it is, and Jewish history does support it, Spain and Portugal and southern France is very important as it relates to Jewish history. Because I'm proposing to you that 1,000 years before Jesus, there were massive communities of Israelites in Spain and Portugal. It was a stronghold for the nation of Israel, and they were engaged in shipping, trade with India. You ever wondered where did the idea of trade with India, the East, the Orient, come from? Why was Spain and Portugal so just committed to establishing trade with the East? Because particularly the Portuguese, they've been doing it since Solomon. It may have stopped after Solomon no longer was king and the nation of Israel lost its strength. The trade route stopped. Obviously, it stopped, right? But they had the knowledge of the ancient trade, the ancient roots. They had it, especially the Portuguese. All right, so we'll get to that in a moment. So, where does that leave us? Jerusalem destroyed. We're talking now about 300 AD. Jerusalem completely destroyed. There are pockets of Jews now after 70 AD throughout North Africa, pockets of Jews in Asia Minor, right? And in Europe, I'm talking now about Greece. There are pockets of Jews in Greece, Jewish communities in Rome, quite a few. But The mass of the Jewish communities, the majority of the Jewish strength at this time was in Babylon, surrounding Persia, and Iberia. These were the two strongholds of Jewish life at this time. 300 AD, 500 AD. This is where they were strong, and they stayed that way up until when? The advent of Islam. Now, the advent of Islam is important. It's important, and of course, it drives Jewish history, Israeli history. So now, up to the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, 6th century, life in Iberia is wonderful. They're prospering. The enemies are not really hostile towards them, not so much. Who were the enemies at this point? Who were the leading peoples of Spain and Portugal at this point? The Visigoths. The Visigoths, they're Germanic people. After Rome had made war with the Germanic peoples of the north, we know that the Germanic people won. They won the Western Kingdom, and the Germanic peoples, who were the Visigoths, they eventually moved into all of Rome's territory. Particularly over here, Spain, France, Portugal, even in Italy, the Visigoths were strong. The Roman Empire had moved eastward to get away from the Visigoths. So by the 3rd, 4th century, the Visigoths were the ruling, the sort of the nobility, nobility. They were the nobility and the leading classes in Iberia, but the Phoenicians, or the sons of Israel, were the dominant class. They were the traders. They were the maritime people. They were the ship people in this area. But of course, the nobility was the Visigoths. And so that went on in Spain and Portugal for 300 or 400 years, and it was an excellent time for Jewish life in Iberia. In Babylon now, things began to get very difficult. Why? Because of Islam, right? 6th, 7th century AD, we have Muhammad. And in a very, very short space of time, Muhammad branches out from Mecca and Medina, the Arabian Peninsula, and he begins to move north, east, west, and he's conquering everything in his path. He takes the whole Arabian Peninsula in a very short space of time, and he begins to move eastward, Iraq, which is now Iraq, northern Turkey, and so on. And Iran was a huge, or what we call Iran today, which was Persia, was a huge target for Islam, for Muhammad. And I think we know some of the story. His uncle Ali became the ruler of Persia, and from that branch of Islam we have Shiite Islam today. So Shiite Islam, the uncle of Muhammad, Ali, took possession of this part of Islam's territory, and he began to, guess what, oppress the Jews of Susa and Babylon. We're talking here in the 7th century AD. What's happening in Spain at this time? Life is wonderful in Spain. Everyone's prospering in Spain. The Jews are, the sons of Israel are doing really well. What are they prospering with? They were tax farmers. They were tax farmers. They were actual farmers as well. But by and large, they would stay away. What the sons of Israel did in Iberia is they imported industry. They imported industry into Iberia, and they would set up industry and prosper off of it while the other peoples will work the industry. And some of the industries that they brought to Iberia was wine, olive oil. They literally brought all of that with them from the land of Israel. And they were tax farmers, they were financiers, they were the business class of Iberia, and they were prospering. That period in Spain and Portugal, what is now Spain and Portugal, Iberia, is referred to as the golden years of Judaism, when they were at peace and everything was fine. The nobility of that part of Europe loved them. They made lots of money on their behalf, and they just loved the Jewish. Everything was fine. A wonderful relationship. Very little persecution, some by Catholicism, but not very, very much. Now, once Islam began to run amok over here in the Eastern world and North Africa, and so what did Islam do? Islam immediately, well, Muhammad took the Arabian Peninsula. His uncle began to move eastward and pushing eastward all the way to the region of Afghanistan into India and so on. And then Muhammad himself and some of his foot soldiers, they traveled westward, North Africa. Their goal was ultimately to take the entire region of North Africa, and then, of course, come into Europe. Andalusia, as they refer to it in Arabic, Andalusia. So that was their huge aspiration to conquer Europe, and they would do it through the Straits of Gibraltar, cross over the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain and take all of this. And guess what? They began to do just that. They crossed over the Gibraltar and they began to move into the land of, to the Spanish lands, or what became the Spanish lands, and they became known as the Moors. You've heard of the Moors, right? The Moors. And so they were referred to as the Moors, the Muslims of the North African region, Tunisia, Morocco, and this whole area. And for about 300 or 400 years, the Moors lived together with the Jewish people of Spain and Portugal. And what was happening in Babylon at this time? While the Moors had moved to Iberia, the Visigoth kings had backed away a little bit, started going northwards because the Muslims were strong, the Moors were strong and dominant. And so the Moors moved into what we know as Spain and Portugal. They began to possess all of the Jewish communities, driving the actual Spaniards or the Visigoths north into Castile and further into France and so on. And so the Visigoths were retreating. What was happening in Babylon? Well, Jews from Babylon were fleeing Babylon. Most of them went north. Right along this line that I'm indicating right here. Most of the Jews went from Susa, regions of Babylon, and traveled northwards. There were many Jews at that time in Saudi Arabia, what is today Saudi Arabia, Arabian Peninsula, and they sort of hunkered down, and they kind of latched on and dug in for the long haul. But most of the Jews of Babylon or Persia decided to go north, travel north, and they became ultimately the Ashkenazis. They integrated with the Ashkenaz people, and they became Ashkenazis. Not all of them, but many of them did. But at the same time, many of the people of Susa and Babylon, the Jewish people, the sons of Israel of Susa and Babylon, decided that they are going to escape via this route and get to Spain and Portugal, which was, of course, New Israel to a certain extent. It was a peaceful land. Life was good over there, and so many of the Jews of Babylon, they made their way over here into Spain and Portugal. In fact, today you have many Jews with names like Medina, Jews with the name Medina, and the Sosa. Right? Where did those names come from? Medina and Sosa came from over here, right? Jews with the name Medina, Sosa, and other names. They left the area here and they made their way into Spain. And you find many Spaniards that are not Jews with the name Medina and de Sosa. It tells us that their descendants were ultimately from Susa, de Sosa, Susa, and Medina, and they made their way over to the safe haven of Iberia. So we're talking now 8th, 9th, 10th century, following the conquest of Islam in this part of the world. Now what was happening in the 8th, 9th, 10th century in regards to the conquest of Islam, of the Holy Land, and much of this part of the world, and the Moors? Well, Northern Europe, France, England, Germany, and other parts of the Northern Europe decided that they had to go and liberate the land of the Moors and the Muslims, right? That's what we call the Crusades. right? So the Christian kings of the north, England, Germany, France, Norway, all these northern states, they pulled their resources together and they charged southward to liberate Jerusalem and all the lands of the Moors and the Muslims, the Muslims as they were called. And that became the Crusades. You don't realize this, but the Crusades were very strong in Spain, right about where this line is right here. In other words, the Crusaders came down here and they formed a line, they drew a line in the sand, so to speak, and they held off the Moors. They held off the Moors. Mostly the Visigoths, the Germans, did that. Held off the Moors. And the Moors were concentrated here for a period, like I said, of about 400 or 500 years following the Crusades. 4 or 5, yeah, following the Crusades. So, we're up now, I'm going to take a break now. We're up now to about the 14th century, the 1300s, where the Crusades have been fought. Jerusalem is once again back in the hands of the Moorish people, or the Islamic people. Spain, what is now Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, is split in half. To the north, you have the Visigoth kings, the Christians. To the south, you have the Moors and the Jews. You understand the dynamic, right? In the north, you have Christian kings and Jews living in the north, the sons of Israel. In the south, you have Moors and sons of Israel cohabitating wonderfully, getting along splendidly. This did what to the kings of the north, the Christian kings? How did they view that? Not very well. And they began to see the Jews, the sons of Israel, of southern Iberia as traitors, as threats. 1300s, 1200s. And so that brings us to what? The Inquisitions, the persecution of the Jewish people in Iberia. Remember at this time, now we're talking now about 10th century on to about the 14th century, Babylon is more or less subdued. The Jewish population of Babylon more or less has dwindled to about 10% of what it was formerly. Most of them went north. Many of them joined their brethren over in Europe. So Europe, Spain and Portugal, southern France, becomes a dense populated place of the sons of Israel. There were already large communities in Spain and Portugal and southern France, and they were joined by many of the refugees, the escapees from Babylon. Right? That brings us up to about the 1300s, and we'll pick it up from there when we come back. So we're up to a pivotal point now in the history, the life of the Jewish nation. That point, of course, like we said before I took off before we took off for the break, is the conflict that leads to ultimately the expulsion edict of 1492. The expulsion edict, 1492. I think it was August of 1942, August 31st. I think it was 1492. Everyone says the Inquisition began in 1492. That's not true. The Inquisition actually began 150 years before. The office of the Inquisitor really was a Dominican order, part of the Spanish Church, and they established the office of the Inquisitor. The Inquisition began in the 1300s, actually. So from the 1300s, they began to forcibly convert Jews, okay? In Spain, mostly in Spain at this point, Aragon and further, Castile, further areas up north in Spain. Now, so what was the pressure we just talked about in Spain? What was the pressure? You had the Moors in the south who were getting along very well with the sons of Israel, with the Jewish people. In the south of Iberia. In the north of Iberia into France, you had the Visigoths who were not pleased with that arrangement at all. They began to persecute the Jews that were in France, and began to ultimately convert them, to forcibly convert them. Many of the Jews of France went into Spain. They became known as Francos, and so on. They took on names that were indicative of their origin. So many of the Francos of Spain and Portugal were actually some of the Jews that left France during that period. So ultimately, we know the story of King Isabella and Ferdinand. They were Visigoths, right? We think of them as Spaniards, but they're not. They were Visigoths, they were German. And they were very Anglo, Isabella and Ferdinand. So Isabella and Ferdinand took on the Moors of the south. They had help, of course, from the other Visigoth kingdoms of the north, the Christian kingdoms of the north. And ultimately, they succeeded against the Moors, and they pushed the Moors out of Iberia and, well, Spain mostly. And they claimed the entire Iberian Peninsula as no longer Andalusia, the land of the Muslims, the land of the Moors, but Spanish territory. They began to unite the different states of what was Spain, Aragon, Castile, and so on, and they formed what we know as Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella did that. Of course, Ferdinand and Isabella decided to commission a certain navigator by the name of Columbus to travel west to get to the east. What a novel idea. And so Columbus persuaded, well, not Columbus. Columbus wasn't the factor that he was a young man. He wasn't that respected in the Spanish court at this point. So Ferdinand and Isabella, they just got done overcoming the Moors. The Inquisition was already in place. They were having great difficulty keeping the converts, the new Christians, let's call them new Christians. They were having a lot of difficulty keeping the new Christians Christians. There was always the reality of reversion. They would revert back to being Jews, and then that brought the office of Inquisition into existence. The office of the Inquisition was not to forcibly convert Jews, but to keep the new Christians as Jews, and to enforce that they're staying faithful Jews, that they're remaining to be faithful Jews. And so that was the Inquisition. Okay. Again, the Inquisition existed way back into the 1300s. So Ferdinand and Isabella had this dilemma with the Jews constantly reverting back to Judaism. Now, on the very same day that Columbus sailed west, which was the idea of three very important Jews in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand, and I don't have their names right now, shame on me. I think Abravanel was one of the names. Anyway, you had three very important Jews in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, who convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to trust this young Italian navigator, Christopher Columbus, to go west to get to the east. He was convinced that you had to go west to get to the east. And so why were they looking to get to the east? To reestablish the ancient route to Ophir, or what became known as India. Right? They wanted to get to the east, the Orient, to get the spices, the pepper, and all of the goodies of the east. And so, persuaded to go west to get to the east, Spain begins to focus on the west through the work of Columbus and the three Jews in his court, in their court, while the Portuguese are doing what? While Spain is going west to get to the east, the Portuguese began to do what? Bartolome Diaz, he took the ancient route. Well, Vasco da Gama, who followed him, took the ancient route. Bartolome Diaz discovered the Cape of Good Hope. No, he didn't. They knew about the Cape of Good Hope. It's always been there. The ancient Israelites used it. So the navigators, Zacuto and all of the other famous navigators, they always knew about the Cape of Good Hope. They were the cartographers, Zacuto and all of the other really, Jewish cartographers of that period. They were drawing maps of the world. They knew exactly what was to the west of Europe. They knew it wasn't the Orient. And that's why Zacuto inspired Columbus. He also inspired Bartolome Diaz at the same time, and ultimately Vasco da Gama, who would circumvent the Cape of Good Hope and get to the Orient. Vasco da Gama was a Jew. He was a Jew. And as the Portuguese sailed south and east to get to the Orient, of course, what happened? They won they won the race. They won the war for the East. The contest between Spain and Portugal. Portugal won the spices. It was a plan. I'm going to propose to you, it was a plan from the very beginning. That the Jews in the court of Spain, of Ferdinand and Isabella, they knew very well that their brothers, the Portuguese, were about to sail south and east to get to the Orient. And if they can manage to get Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, focus on the west, it would be a good deterrent, which is exactly what happened. Now, there was another benefit of Columbus and his 3 galleons sailing west to get to the east, in that throughout the eastern part of this continent began to develop small Jewish enclaves: Brazil, Guyana, Mexico, St. Augustine, different parts of the Caribbean. Within 20, 30 years of Columbus's trip to the eastern coast of the Western Hemisphere, they began to develop Jewish communities throughout the area. Go figure. All right, so Columbus discovered the Americas. Where did he land at first? Well, he stopped off in the Bahamas. He went to what is now the Dominican Republic, and then he actually put foot first on Cuba, what we know as Cuba. By the way, Cuba is what he named the island. Cuba is a very small town, Cuba, in Portugal. What's the connection between Cuba and Portugal and Cuba in the Caribbean? Cuba in Portugal is where Columbus was actually born. He's not Italian, he's Portuguese. Most Portuguese historians know it very well. His actual name, and this is how he spelled his name in the cathedral when he converted in Genoa, he actually wrote his name in perfect Portuguese, Salvador Gonzalez, or Fernandez, Salvador Fernandez Zaco. That's how he wrote his name, in perfect Portuguese, accenting the letters in perfect Portuguese. Salvador Fernandez Zaco was actually his name. He took on the name Christopher Columbus. He took on the identity of an Italian navigator, but he wasn't. He was born in Cuba, Portugal. He grew up on the island of Madeira. By the way, conventional history tells us that he took his wife, Peristella, was her last name. What was her first name? Someone can look it up for me. Her first name was Isabella, not Isabella, but her last name was Peristella. Peristella was a very Jewish name. Conventional history tells us that his wife was a Jew who converted to Christianity. No, she was converted. And so Columbus grew up on the island of Madeira, which conventional history will not tell you, but that's where he grew up. That's where he learned of the trade winds. You see, because the Jews of Madeira and the Azores and Portugal, they knew of the trade winds for centuries. And they were fishing the eastern coast of the Western Hemisphere for at least 1,000 years by the time Columbus sailed west to get to the east. Yes, the Portuguese fishermen, they were all Jews. And they knew of the Western Hemisphere, and they knew that it wasn't the Orient. That's why the Portuguese said, you guys go west and we'll go south and east. So the same Portuguese fishermen that Columbus grew up with and observed and went fishing with as a child, by the way, certain Portuguese historians, they say that Columbus, Salvador Fernandez Zaco, as a child, went on fishing campaigns along the eastern coast of this continent as a child. The ships will go off and spend a year and come back with their bounty. What was their bounty? Codfish. That's what they came for. Galleons of Portuguese fishermen every year would take the trade winds around, fish the eastern coast of this continent, and arrive back at Madeira. What is it about codfish? You've heard of bacalao. You know what bacalao is? Okay. Bacalao is salted codfish. The Spanish and the Portuguese, they love it. In fact, the Italian, all the Mediterranean peoples love bacalao. Where did it come from? Bacalao is codfish. The word bacalao is a Portuguese derivative, and it means the friendly fish, bacalao. So, the Madeirans and the Azazons and the Portuguese were fishing, and they were all Jews. And this is the Jewish connection. They were all Jews. They were fishing this part of the Western Hemisphere for codfish. They would salt the codfish along the coast of wherever they would fish, Nova Scotia, this area. They would salt the codfish, stack it away in their galleons, and bring them back around a year later to the Azores, where they would ship them into the Mediterranean salted codfish. That's why they've been eating salted codfish, what we call bacalao, for centuries in the Mediterranean. You go to some of the most remote places in the Mediterranean, and salted codfish is a staple. And it's been that way for over 1,000 years. That's because the Portuguese have been fishing this continent for that long. They knew very well that Columbus or Salvador was sending the Spaniards on a wild goose chase. They knew it very well. It was a conspiracy, a Jewish conspiracy. Because the three Jews in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella knew very well they were connected to Portugal. In fact, Abravanel was Portuguese. He ended up in the Spanish court. Go figure. So, all of this had to do with the Jews of Spain preparing to leave Spain. Now, why at this time? Because the Inquisition at this point had been going for over 150 years. Jews were being forced to convert. All of their monies were being taken from them. All of their riches were being taken from them. They were being forced to be Christians, and they were being subdued at the same time. Many of them were being killed for reverting back to Judaism. So Columbus, Salvador, being motivated or sponsored by very wealthy Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, most of them Portuguese at this point, financed through the King of Spain and the Queen of Spain journeys to the Western world. And that's why within 20 or 30 years of Columbus landing in the Caribbean and in the Americas, and Cabral discovering Brazil, you have Jewish communities peppered throughout Brazil, all the way up to Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, Curacao, Jamaica, all throughout the Caribbean, down to South America, up to as far north as St. Augustine. You have Jewish communities coming into existence. Texas. I don't have time. I can tell you so much more about the Jews of Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. Luis de Caballal, who was granted the entire area over here, Mexico, California, New Mexico, this entire area here was granted to Luis de Caballal, who was a converted Jew. He was a conquistador, bringing Christianity to the Western world, but he wasn't. He was a Jew and a committed Jew. His son, Luis de Caballal II, reverted to Judaism here in New Mexico, around Albuquerque. By the way, Albuquerque is a Jewish name. It's a Sephardic Jewish name. Around Albuquerque, he reverted to Judaism, and he, Luis de Caballal II, began to lead hundreds of communities back to Judaism. He was ultimately burnt to the stake in Mexico City at the Auto de Fe in Mexico City. He would not have denounced his Judaism, and he died at the stake along with many others. So, without time to go into this fully, I'll say this. The discovery of the Western world, of the Americas, by the way, America, a Sephardic Jewish name. When Columbus came over, at that time, a Sephardic Jew from Portugal, his last name was America, he landed in Brazil and began to travel throughout the area. He made journeys from Brazil, the east coast of Brazil, all the way around the Caribbean, up to what is now North America, and because of him, This entire continent became known as America.
I thought it was America Vespucci.
But he was a Jew. He was a Portuguese Jew. You see, the Jews of Iberia, they flew under the Italian flag, together with the Jews of Spain. They were all together. They were not loyal to the Portuguese, the Spaniards, or the Italians. They were loyal to Col Israel. And so, America, they say but he's not Italian. He was Portuguese. Just like Columbus. Salvador Fernandez Zaco, Portuguese. And you know, it's so amazing because this information is coming out. Historians are writing about this. But at the very cathedral where he signed his name for the first time in Genoa as Christopher Columbus, his original name was exactly Salvador Fernandez Zaco, written in perfect Portuguese. And when he wrote in his journals, he wrote in Portuguese. He didn't write in Latin or Italian. He wrote in perfect Portuguese. Columbus, on his 5th journey, was arrested and accused of, guess what? Judaizing. And they wanted to take him to the Inquisition. He was accused of Judaizing, which he was doing. He wasn't Judaizing, but he was providing havens for, I think it was his 3rd trip. Maybe it was his 3rd trip. He was providing havens for Jewish communities that were fleeing Spain and Portugal. On the very day that the expulsion edict was proclaimed, announced, Columbus sailed. Go figure. On the very day that the expulsion edict, think about it. We say that, I think it's 31st of August, 1492, Columbus sailed to the Western world, to the New World. But it was on that same day that Ferdinand and Isabella issued that Jews should leave their realm. On Columbus, 3 ships. The ships were laden with conversos, new Christians. Most of the people on his ships were new Christians. The first guy that put his foot on the island of Cuba, what was his last name? What was his last name? Very, very famous Spanish last name. Well, this what I'll get his name. He was the first European Spaniard to put foot in the Western Hemisphere. He wasn't, but that's what they tell us. Okay, he was Columbus's interpretator, interpretator. He was speaking Hebrew when he landed in Cuba. Hebrew was one of the languages because they believed that they were going to encounter some of the 10 lost tribes in the Western world. And so they brought this guy, and I can't remember his name right now, starts with an A. And so Columbus, to circumvent a lot of what I want to tell you, Columbus and the others that followed after him, many of them, they were simply looking for safe havens in the Western Hemisphere to revert back to who they were, Jews to begin with. It happened throughout Brazil, and what is today's Recife? Recife? You say Recife, it's called Recife. In today's Recife, the region of Pernambuco, when the Jews came from Madeira, Portugal, they brought sugar cane to Pernambuco. They built for the first time ever the first sugar cane mill in Pernambuco, what is today's Recife. And they began to prosper. They brought sugar cane from Madeira, the home of Christopher Columbus, and they began to prosper in this part of Brazil, another Jewish name. And suddenly the Portuguese crown, which is actually the Spanish crown because the Spaniards had taken over Portugal at that time, the Spanish crown via the Portuguese crown began to come up from Rio de Janeiro to attack the Jews in the northeastern part of Brazil. Bahia was the actual state, the state of Bahia, Pernambuco, Bahia, and pushed them out. That war is called the Portuguese-Dutch War. It wasn't a Portuguese-Dutch war. It was the Portuguese crown together with the Spanish crown persecuting the Jews that had begun to succeed in the sugarcane industry under the Dutch flag. How did the Dutch, now this is going to bring us to current history, I hope. How did the Dutch get involved in this complete melee of confusion? The Portuguese, who were a maritime people, they were navigators of the ancient world, the Jews, began to, well, the ones who were forcibly converted, I should get back to 1492. 1492, the expulsion edict. Jews were forced to leave Spain. Many of them went to North Africa. Most of them went to Turkey, but actually most of them crossed over into Portugal. 150,000 Jews crossed over into Portugal to join with the 75,000 Jews that were already there. So you had 150,000 Jews crossed over into Portugal, 75,000 were there, 225,000 Jews existed in Portugal. The population of Portugal at the time was 700,000. So close to half, a third of the population of Portugal were Jewish at that time. And the Jews of Portugal who had the means, they had the money, they went to places like Hamburg, Amsterdam, and England. So very powerful Jews, maritime Jews, they were into the shipping industry for millennia. They went to Amsterdam, Holland. The King of Holland welcomed them. Why? Because they were bringing technology that the Dutch did not have. The Dutch were not a maritime people, neither were the Britons. The Britons were not a maritime people at all. They knew nothing about the sea. That's why they were landlocked. They were landlocked. They knew nothing about the ocean. They were not a maritime people, neither were the Dutch. Until the Jews of Portugal began to be accepted into their realms, into their kingdoms. And the Jews who went to Portugal, the very rich, the Jews that went to Holland, the very rich Jews of Portugal, imported shipping industry to Holland. All of a sudden, Holland is a maritime power, and so is England. They were not. They were actually Jews from Spain and Portugal. And so Holland now, the Jews of Portugal, the very wealthy and prosperous Jews of Portugal, are now sailing under the flag of the Dutch. And now there's an industry in the Caribbean. What is the industry? Sugarcane. The Dutch West Indian Company. You've heard of the Dutch West Indian Company. If you Google it, it's been around for 400 years. That's because the Dutch began the Portuguese Jews under the Dutch flag began to ship galleons into Brazil and ship tons of sugar back to Europe. That was the industry. Until the Spanish crown, via the Portuguese crown, decided to incite violence and to destroy the Jewish community of Pernambuco, which they succeeded to do, which brought the Jews from Pernambuco, the eastern coast of Brazil, up to the Caribbean. There were already Jews in the Caribbean from Columbus's work, but the Jews of Pernambuco, the Portuguese Jews of Pernambuco, came up the Caribbean. They settled in what is Cayenne, French Guyana, Suriname, Guyana, not so much Trinidad, Tobago, but they had to leave Tobago quickly. Curacao, Aruba, Jamaica, Cuba. In other words, the Sephardic Jews, the Portuguese Jews of Pernambuco that originally came from Madeira, that originally came from Portugal, that originally came from Israel, found their way up the Caribbean, up the coast of South America, up into the Caribbean, and settled more or less in this area. I should use the pointer. They came into Puerto Rico, what is now Puerto Rico, in 1649, I think it was 1649, the governor of Puerto Rico complained to the King of Spain to the effect that most of the immigrants coming into Puerto Rico are Portuguese conversos, and that they would revert. That was his complaint. Nothing was done about it. What could he have done? And he was correct. Most of the immigrants coming into Puerto Rico and and Hispaniola, Dominican Republic at that time, and into Cuba, Jamaica, and most of the islands in the Caribbean were Portuguese Jews flying under the Dutch flag, coming into the Caribbean and establishing industry, Dutch West Indian Company. Of course, that went on for quite a while. Now, how did the Jews of Pernambuco, Madeira, Portugal, Spain, Israel, how did they end up in New York and the east coast of the United States of America? Now, keep in mind, there were already Jews, conversos, most of them, what we call Marranos, crypto-Jews, throughout Texas, New Mexico, Phoenix, all the way to California and in Mexico. Why were they Marranos? Why were they conversos, crypto-Jews? Because the Inquisition cracked down on them. After Luis de Cavalle began to lead entire communities of Jews back to Judaism, the Inquisition really cracked down on them, the Jesuits. And they were importing them into Mexico City by the dozens for the auto de fe, for the burnings and the torturings. And that was literally an industry at one point. And that's how. So there were Jews in the central part of this continent, but they were all suppressed. How did Jews, free practicing Jews, end up in New Amsterdam, or what is now New York City? You look up the history. They were actually Jews from Pernambuco that were pushed away from Pernambuco, and they came up the Caribbean. Initially, they settled in Tobago, or they wanted to settle in Tobago, but there were already a community of Jews in Tobago that were fighting off the Carib Indians, the hostile Carib Indians, and the Jewish community in Tobago, 2 galleons of them that were already in Tobago, said, no, we can't have you here. You got to go somewhere else. You got to move on. That galleon that came from Pernambuco of Jews couldn't take them. Why? Because we were fighting to survive, and we couldn't stand to have another community, another galleon, 40 people or whatever it was. So it's tough on this little island, go somewhere else. So if you go to Tobago today, which is the sister island of Trinidad where I'm from, the center of the island, it's like a volcanic island with a high peak in the middle. The center of the island is called Moriah. It's been called Moriah ever since the Dutch landed on the island, but they were not Dutch. They were Brazilian Portuguese Jews that settled on the island. They went up to the top of the island, which is what you want to do if you're going to defend yourself from the Carib Indians, who were cannibals and warlike. So they went up to the top of the island. They fortified the top of the island. The fort is still there today, or what's left of it, and it's called Moriah. And down in the plain, and you can go there today, and you can go to what is called Canaan. And you get the history of Canaan and Moriah is that the Dutch, when they came, they went up to the top of the island to fend themselves away from the Indians, the Caribs, and they called where the Caribs lived in the plains, Canaan. And there was this war between the Dutch Jews, the Portuguese Jews, and the Carib Indians, went on for about 20 years. And finally, the Dutch prevailed over the Carib Indians, but then came the French and the British, and Sir Walter Raleigh came in, and there was all sorts of... Anyway, so the Dutch finally left Tobago and went to Curacao. So you go to Curacao today, and there's a thriving Jewish community in Curacao. So the Dutch left Tobago, but that one galleon that came from Pernambuco that was refused to dock at Tobago had nowhere to go. It went further north, couldn't go into Puerto Rico because they would have known that they were all Jews from Pernambuco. You see, the Jews that went into Puerto Rico and Hispaniola or Dominican Republic, they came up the islands. They didn't come on galleons. They couldn't dare pull up in the port in Puerto Rico in a galleon because everybody would have known that they were Jews from Pernambuco. So they went straight up. According to the history, they considered coming into St. Augustine not a good place. They went further up and they anchored off the coast of what is now New York, what was then New Amsterdam, and they did what? They parked, they anchored their ship out there, and they wanted to come ashore. They inquired of the governor of New Amsterdam at the time if they can come ashore and dock their boat in New Amsterdam because they were Dutch. They were flying under the Dutch flag.
What year would that have been?
That's 1650-ish, 1655, because they had fled from the Dutch-Portuguese War in Pernambuco. About 2 or 3 years later, they made their way all the way up to Amsterdam. They wanted to integrate in the Caribbean, but they were refused in Tobago and other places. So they found their way all the way up to New Amsterdam, and the governor of New Amsterdam would not allow them into the port. He didn't want Jews in his city. Because to this point, New York, the eastern coast of what is now the United States of America, was Jew-free. At least that's what they thought. It was Jew-free. And the governor of New York or New Amsterdam did not want Jews in his new kingdom. Ultimately, the Jews prevailed and they were received into New York. And that is the very first accepted Jewish community, practicing Jewish community in continental United States. But originally they were Brazil or Madeiran, Portuguese obviously came from Israel, and they traveled up here and made it to Amsterdam and ultimately was accepted. So you go to New York today and there's a huge Sephardic synagogue that's still there today that was built by the sons and daughters of these same Jews who were rejected and refused entry into the port of New Amsterdam. That synagogue is still there today, and if you go to the synagogue today, and that's something I need to do before I die, I want to go to that synagogue and just take it in. The names of the founders of the synagogue are Spinoza, de Souza, de Castro, all Portuguese names. You go up there, it's an amazing thing. Very common names in the formation of that synagogue. They're all Portuguese. They're all Sephardic. They're all derived from Hesefi. Now, once those Sephardic Jews took entry and began to establish communities in New York, of course, they spanned out. Went into the Carolinas. Originally, the Jewish community of New York that began to grow. Why? Because they began to receive more of their countrymen from Brazil, from the Caribbean. And so what's happening now we're talking the early 17th century, or early 18th century, 1700s. What's happening in this area right here? Jews from Brazil, the Caribbean, all over the Caribbean, are finding out that it's good to be a Jew in New York. You can practice your faith freely in New York. And so New York, the Carolinas, became a haven. And for at least a century and a half, Jewish life in the Carolinas and all the way up to New York and into Nova Scotia was wonderful. And of course, they're still there today. Ultimately, in the 1900s, they would make their way down to Miami. And so the point of saying that is the original Jews of the eastern coast of this continent were all Sephardic Jews who originated from Portugal to Madeira to Brazil, up the Caribbean to New York and into this area right here. Jeremy Gimpel, some of his family came from the Carolinas. You have many Carolinian Jews today. Originally, they go all the way back to Portugal. That's not to say that in the mid-1800s, towards the end of the 1800s, Jews from Europe, Eastern Europe, did not begin to integrate into or with the Jewish community of the Americas. Sure, it happened. But it wasn't as quick and as intense as you think. In the 1800s, trickles of Jews began to come over from Europe, Eastern Europe, that is. The Ashkenazi Jews, in other words. And so what happened? World War I, the lead up to World War I and into World War II is when the Ashkenazi Jews began to leave Eastern Europe in large numbers and filter into the United States of America, into South America, even into the Caribbean, and integrated with the Jews that were already there. That goes all the way back to the Portuguese and the Spanish Jews of Iberia. Now, many of the Iberian Jews, mostly Portuguese, went to Holland, Hamburg, and Amsterdam, and England, and Poland. These Jews They settled here and they went further east and south into Germany, Hungary, Vienna, and so they were all originally Sephardic Jews. They integrated with the Ashkenazi Jews and they lost their Sephardic identity. Right? Like for instance, Rabbi Wallman, his wife, when I met her, she came over here and I spoke with her. She asked me about my heritage. I told her that my family is from Portugal, Madeira. And she said, oh, so is my family. And she told me a little bit, and the same history. Her family left Madeira, not Madeira, Portugal, Lisbon. My family went south to Madeira. We were not as fortunate as her family. Her family probably had more money, more means. Anyway, her family went from Lisbon to Holland to Hamburg into Germany. And when World War II came along, her family went into land of Israel. Left Europe and went, but originally, and she knows it, her family originally came from Lisbon, Portugal. And many of the Jews of today originated in Iberia. So what you had happening around the mid-1800s into the 1900s is you had Ashkenazi Jews from the east moving westward and integrating with the descendants of Sephardic Jews that were in this area, and they merged into one Jewish people. Many of them, of course, 6 million of them died during the Holocaust, but many of them leading up to World War II left Europe and moved into the land of Israel, Egypt, Turkey, and so on. North Africa, even at that time. Many of them during the Nazi terror period came over to the West, South America, even in the Caribbean, Canada, and into what is now the United States of America. Now, what's happening in the West, in the eastern part of the world? Is there Judaism over here? Is there a Jewish community over in the Orient? Yes, there is. And a very thriving community over here as well. Because of Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese that came over, you had in throughout southern India, in Cochin and different parts of the Indian coast, even into what is today Indonesia, all the way to Japan, you had Portuguese Jewish communities cropping up all over here. And they were free Jews. They were free Jews because they didn't have to worry about the Spanish crown. They didn't have to face the Inquisition, but life was difficult over here. Life was easier over here, even though the Inquisition was running amok. Go figure. All right, so from this time, now we're talking the early 1900s, mid-1900s. Of course, we know that at that time, the State of Israel came into being. So you have all of this movement, persecution, forced conversion, reversion, crypto-Jewish movements, Marranos. You have all these things happening. You have Jews that are free Jews in continental United States. You have Jews that are free Jews in Europe but persecuted. Horribly persecuted. You have free Jews that are making aliyah, going to different parts of Africa and Asia as free Jews, persecuted but free. The only bastion of free Judaism is the Americas. Mostly Brazil, not Argentina so much because the Nazis ultimately moved into Argentina, made life difficult for the Jews in Argentina. But Chile, Brazil, even Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, the Caribbean islands, even in Central America somewhat, and Mexico, not so much. And in the Americas, you had free Jews. That brings us up to the Zionist movement of the 1800s, early 1900s. And of course, they're coming into existence, the State of Israel. And once the State of Israel came into existence, well, that's the call of the Spirit of God calling Jews back to the land, period. And Jews from all over the world actually began to make aliyah and return to the land of Israel. So many of the Jews who were in the Americas, Brazil, some of them, they've been there since Cabral and America and Columbus. They began to make aliyah, and a lot of the Jews that are Western European also made Aliyah, and 1948 to here we are today. The process of the ingathering continues. You have a very, very strong Sephardic community in South Florida. They are the descendants of the Cuban Jews. All right. So when Castro implemented communism in Cuba, thousands of Jews who've been in Cuba since Pernambuco, Madeira, Portugal, thousands of them crossed over into Miami. Of course, you know the story. Even before Castro, they were coming into Miami. Because one thing about the Jewish people is that they can see difficulty coming. And they saw that Cuba was a prosperous place for a long time, but they saw years before Castro did what he did, that things would get difficult there, and they came into Miami. Places like Trinidad in the 1970s, you had about 8,000 Jews on the island. Then came the populist movement and uprising in the late 1960s, early 70s, and they all left the island. They saw it coming 2 or 3 years before, and they all went to Canada mostly, and so you have a constant migration of Jews fleeing difficult places where life was difficult. Most of them coming to the Americas, Miami, New York, and settling in that area right there. The Jamaican Jews, for instance, the Jamaican Jews. The Jews stayed in Jamaica much longer than they did in Cuba, in Trinidad, in certain parts of the Caribbean where life was tough. Why? Because life was good in Jamaica. You still have Jews in Jamaica today. The synagogues are still kept, just like in Curacao and other places of the Caribbean. But slowly, it's becoming less populated with Jewish people in that area, and most of them are settling for the good life in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago. But you have still a movement, even to this point today, of Jews slowly returning to the land of Israel, making Aliyah, and that is coming from every direction. You even have today descendants of the 10 lost tribes that are coming from the Peshmergan Trail all the way over to China and making Aliyah, coming back to the land of Israel. I can tell you so much more. I skipped so much important history. I just don't have the time to go over all of it. But, so where does that bring us today? It takes us all the way back to Sinai, right? Takes us all the way back to Sinai, the dispersion from the land of Israel, Babylon they went to, many of them, North Africa into ultimately Spain and Portugal, Iberia, where they prospered, Andalusia. Well, things got tough in Andalusia. The Spanish crown and the Roman Catholics made things very difficult. They had to flee from Andalusia, and the Azores, the North African cities, North African coastline, and then from there they hopped over to the Atlantic, because of Cabral, into Brazil, where they prospered very well until they were pushed out, pushed up the Caribbean, into the Americas, and the Jews now in Europe, we know their story very well. Jews from Iberia, Portugal, and Italy, certain parts of that area, went into Northern Europe, integrated with the Ashkenazi Jews of the East, and many of them are still there even today. Many of them died in the Holocaust, but many of them also came over to New York. Most of the Jews in New York today are Ashkenazi, right? And so that's where we are today. So the process of the ingathering is not complete. You have a little less than half of the Jews that are still scattered throughout the world. I think the most populated center for Jewish life outside of the land of Israel is New York. New York. I'm not sure. I think it's 2 or 3 million Jews in New York only. So between New York and Miami, perhaps Los Angeles, these 3 centers, you have the majority of Jews outside of the land of Israel centered in those 3 areas. So at some point, God's going to give the herald call, and there will be a movement of Jews, of course, from Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, New York, and ultimately they will make Aliyah. I'm not sure exactly how. You still have a good population of Jews in South America. I can tell you so much more. All right, so real quickly, the descendants of the Portuguese Jews, referred to as the Bene Anusim, that's what we call the Bene Anusim. Bene Anusim are the sons of the ones who were coerced. That's what Bene Anusim mean. the sons of the coerced ones. The Bene Anusim movement is growing in intensity right now. Where is it most concentrated? Brazil. Brazil. And why Brazil? Because Brazil was populated by Portuguese Jews, new Christians, converted Christians, who came over to Brazil to find safe haven to practice their ancestral faith, which didn't go on for very long, right? The Inquisition, the long arms of the Inquisition took care of that. So as a result, some researchers believe that over 50 million Brazilians have at least 20% Jewish blood in them. Over 50 million. They believe, some of them believe, and I certainly believe, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an authority on this, but I've done a lot of research on this, that many of the Brazilians are closer to 75 to 90% Sephardic Jews. I have a cousin, she lives in the villages, her name is Franco, Jenny Franco is her name. You can meet her on Facebook. Jenny Franco, I spoke to her about this a few years ago, and she was really impressed by this. And she went out and did a really expensive DNA test, not 23andMe, $75 and you get a DNA test. She did a DNA test, and she paid about $300 for it. It's a good test. And she discovered that she had 95% Jewish blood. And her family came from Grenada. Same history. Madeira, Brazil, Caribbean. It is believed, and I am convinced of it, that more than 50 million Brazilians are closer to 95% Jewish. Why would I say such a thing? Because the Marranos communities, they stayed very close. They integrated, and they didn't integrate. They remained a very close community. They would marry only Marranos. And that went on for about 300 years, 200 or 300 years. So what you have now in communities dotted throughout Brazil, and wait a minute, even in New Mexico, California, and Phoenix, you still have Marranos communities over there. There are communities over there right now, small communities right now in New Mexico, even in Texas, certain parts of California, that they still believe that they're under the Inquisition. They still today, you go into those communities today, and they're small communities, Spanish communities, but they're actually Portuguese, and they will treat you with suspicion because they're thinking you're here to sniff them out, even today. That's what 500 years of the Inquisition will do to a people. And right here in this free land of ours, you have people that are still crypto-Jews. And they're dying out, of course, and the customs are fading away quickly. But there is an awakening, and it's happening. So the fact is this. According to the prophecy that we see in Obadiah, when Obadiah said, now Obadiah is one of the oldest prophets of Israel. He prophesied 900 BC, I think, around the time of King Solomon. Obadiah said that the sons of Sepharad, or the Sephardic world, the sons of Judah who are in Sepharad, in the Sephardic world, will return and inhabit or populate the Negev. That's what Obadiah said about 2,900 years ago. Obadiah said that. Obadiah said that before there was a diaspora of the Jewish people, that the sons of Yerushalayim, he said, and I must go find it in Obadiah. The sons of Jerusalem will return from Sepharad, Spain and Portugal, and where they went, and will inhabit and populate the cities of the Negev. Now, the cities of the Negev are sitting there waiting to be populated. They're not populated. But guess what's happening in the Negev? You have Jews, Sephardic Jews, returning to the land of Israel, and they're beginning to build communities in the Negev. Just as the prophet Obadiah said that they would, it's happening. You have movements of Brazilian descendants of the Sephardic Jews from Brazil and from Mexico moving to the moving to the Negev, and they're building communities right now. There's a Sephardic Jew. His name is Stephen Gomes. You would say Gomez, but it's Gomes. Stephen Gomez or Stephen Gomes. He is very instrumental in setting up communities of Bnei Anusim in the Negev right now. He's been doing it for about 20 years. So you see, the prophecy of Obadiah concerning the return of the sons of Jerusalem from Sepharad is being fulfilled. But my point is this: the numbers can be in the multiple millions, potentially in the multiple millions. Now, if that's not the valley of dry bones being fulfilled, I don't know what is. So when you hear of Ezekiel's prophecy, Ezekiel chapter 37, the valley of dry bones, you think of the state of Israel coming into existence, for sure. But if Obadiah's prophecy were to be fulfilled, and suddenly you have hundreds and thousands of Bnei Anusim making conversion and coming back to Israel, well, that's the valley of dry bones. So what did Spain and Portugal do in the last 10 years? In the last 10 years, Spain most recently, welcome back Sephardic Jews. Please come back. Spain and even Portugal has been saying, we need you back here. Right when their destiny should be the land of Israel, Spain and Portugal is wanting them back into their territories. Well, I don't think they're going to go back to Spain and Portugal. I think ultimately they're going back to the land of Israel. So the whole point to the history of the Jewish nation is that God said that he will disperse them if they would engage in iniquity and idolatry, but there will come that latter day when he will bring them back and restore them to the land of Israel, and that's exactly where we are today. We're seeing the restoration process. More than half of the Jewish nation, the people of Israel, are back in the land of Israel. The other 1/3, or the other close to one half of the Jewish people, are poised and ready to return. They may not know it yet, but they are poised and ready to return. By what means, I don't know, but God will figure it out. I happen to be convinced that the Bnei Anusim movement is going to grow. And you're going to have multiple thousands, even hundreds of thousands of Jews move into the Negev who were formerly forcibly converted, or their ancestors were forcibly converted. It's already happening. I'm seeing it, and I've been believing it now for 25 years. So, Jewish history. Did I miss anything? A bunch. I missed a bunch. But nonetheless, it's enough to say that God drove them out, he protected them, he kept them, and at a certain point he determined to bring them back and reestablish them in the land of Israel, and that's where we are today. That's why we are the most fortunate and blessed generation to be able to be living in this time and to be able to see what we're seeing. Because the end of this is redemption, complete redemption. So, all right, so again, I don't think I covered everything with Jewish history, but I think I skimmed across the top of it. There's so much other facts of Jewish history that I could have talked about, but